would be
Yeah,
good.
we could get started at 10:05. People
Yeah.
are still trickling in.
Oops, did I let her in? Yes.
Oh, that was me.
Ah, okay.
Do I need to lower my, okay, you can see me?
I think perfect there. Yeah.
All right. Well, perfect strong, but it's as good as we're gonna get. Huh?
Okay, I think you can probably go ahead. I'll let more people in if they come while you're starting. But for everyone here, it's very nice to see you. We're incredibly excited to welcome I think it's our second speaker of the day for our first EJ Symposium at Duke. His name is Benjamin Wilson. I'm sure he'll get to introduce himself, but he's the chairman at Beveridge Diamond, which is a law firm here in the United States. They're a leading law firm focused on environmental and natural resource law and litigation. He's represented countless people on numerous cases from corporations, developers, municipalities, etc. Everything you can think of in environmental law and litigation, he's probably done it. He also has been a lecturer at Howard University Law School, as well as a guest lecturer at many other schools. I hope to see Duke on that list someday, but I think in the interest of time, I'll pass it off to him. If you have questions for everyone here, feel free, either you can private message me, Ashley, or you can also just put them in the chat and we'll get to them once he's finished. So I'll pass it to you. Go ahead.
Well, good morning. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I'm Ben Wilson, and I want to thank Colton and Ashley and the other students who have organized this conference. It seems like only yesterday, but about 50 years ago, I started college, and I must confess, I was not nearly as attuned to the great issues of the day around me as you are. So please know you have my great admiration. I've purposefully chosen my title about the opportunity to change the world. Why not you and why not now? The fact of the matter is that we are at an inflection point when it comes to environmental justice. I know that you as students are very much aware not only of EJ issues, but climate issues, the intersection of environmental justice and climate, and something now described as climate justice. And to be sure, the change in administration to the Biden administration and an all-out commitment to environmental justice on so many different levels, not just at EPA, not just at the Department of Justice, but throughout the agencies of government and even in international focus. So the hope is that there will be real progress. And so if you don't mind, we'll go to our next slide here. And the first question is, what is environmental justice? And you're probably quite familiar at this point with the EPA definition, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations and policies. I won't insult your intelligence. I know you can read well, and but you can see a slightly different definition from the California Code as an example. And here at the bottom of that slide, hopefully you can see that, is a definition from the United Nations Development Program. So again, general concepts of fairness, meaningful, involvement as it relates to development, implementation, enforcement of laws. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So environmental justice is everywhere. I suspect I have 1 or 2 students or faculty members from Louisiana, and you'll recognize these photographs from New Orleans and the breach there during the time of Katrina. But there are environmental justice issues all over the globe, all around the world. Next slide, please. In here, some of you may recall these photographs from Katrina. It just occurred to me that was 2005, so that's 16 years ago. So maybe you don't entirely recall, but I suspect you've seen these photographs, and they are very powerful, very, very moving, and quite frankly, very, very challenging. And here we see people waiting outside, hoping to get on buses that will take them to a better, to a safer place. And if we could go to the next slide. Here's a little boy holding on to that bottle. His name is Nicholas Herbert. He's 1 year, he's one. And so today, by my math, he'd be 16 or 17 years old, and he's walking with his mother. They have MREs, those meals distributed by the military in a parking lot near the Montreal Convention Center in New Orleans. This was Friday, September 2nd, several days after Katrina. That earlier photograph of the people lying outside the buses, obviously they're all hoping to get out. And the first photograph that we show you the breach at the 17th Street Canal. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. You guys are very good. Thank you so much. I suspect we have 1 or 2 Texans in the crowd as well. And this shows a photograph rather, from this most recent Texas power outage. And we know there was improper grid weatherization, but ask yourself, who was hit hardest in Texas? Who was hit hardest in Katrina? And generally, we're talking about the poor. We're talking about diverse minority groups, discrete and insular minorities, as Justice Jackson once called them in his famous footnote 4 analysis. Next slide, please. And here, well, I think you've seen enough pictures of ice and snow. Please, thank you. Next slide. And again, that shows you the impact inside someone's home. So let's go to the next slide, however, please. So these are key milestones, but I just came across an article. Again, I don't know if there's anyone there from Atlanta or from Georgia, but at the turn of the prior century, there was an issue of environmental justice that was probably seen as plain old-fashioned discrimination, and it involved Proctor Creek. And there was a discharge of raw sewage into Proctor Creek, which impacted the neighborhood where Dr. Martin Luther King raised his family. And a minister of that time protested to the mayor and to the city council about the disparate treatment impacting his community. So suffice it to say, over 120 years ago, people saw environmental justice issues. I generally tend to look at things from the late 1960s, and most of you know that at the time Dr. King was murdered, he was there on a sanitation strike by garbage men and women, if you will, or more appropriately, sanitation workers. then along comes the Warren County, North Carolina site. Ashley reminded me, Mr. Wilson, you need to make this local as much as possible. Well, Warren County is not local, but it is North Carolina. And there was a PCB in the landfill there near a Black community. In 1987, a report that some of you may have read in some of your classes, Toxic Waste and Race, was developed by the United Church of Christ. There was a fellow who headed the NAACP who had a history in North Carolina, the Reverend Ben Chavis. And one day when you have nothing better to do, Google Ben Chavis and you'll see the connection to North Carolina. But this report, the primary author was a fellow by the name of Charles Lee. And it was Charles' work that really prompted a great deal of energy. If I could go back though to the Warren County demonstration, there was one mistake that the state and county authorities made. Among the demonstrators was the congressman from the District of Columbia, Walter Fauntleroy, and because he was a United States congressman, it meant that he could ask for a report. And guess what he did? He had the OMB look at thousands of sites, or maybe not thousands, hundreds of sites across the southeastern United States, and that report by OMB showed the disproportionate location of what we call LULUs, locally unwanted land uses in poor minority communities. In 1994, we get the executive order from President Clinton. Someone is saying, well, why didn't he just pass a law? Then as now, it's not always easy to pass laws. And as you know, throughout our history, from time to time, presidents have issued executive orders to achieve those purposes that they felt they could not necessarily achieve by getting legislation passed. And EJ is no exception. Suffice it to say that as time passed, we've had a greater emphasis on environmental justice and environmental justice principles throughout the early 2000s. More recently, in 2019, Senator Booker from New Jersey proposed the 2019 Environmental Justice Act. Then Senator Harris from California had the Environmental Justice for All Act. Neither was adopted. But as we all know, and some have resisted, Joe Biden was elected president, and he ran on a platform which featured EJ. And as I mentioned earlier, this is truly a very unique time as it relates to environmental issues generally and environmental justice in particular. If I could be specific, some of these examples include emphasizing impacts of global warming on vulnerable communities and incorporating EJ communities into resilience planning. I think I've probably talked through a couple more slides here. And there you see that photograph from that strike right there at the end of Dr. King's life. Next, please. And these are people demonstrating in Warren County. The gentleman in the middle, I believe that's Joe Lowry, who succeeded King at SCLC. And you can see there's a merger of civil rights and environmental issues to form environmental justice. Next slide. Okay, and I mentioned the Toxic Waste and Race report, and it's fascinating. 60% of Black and Hispanic Americans live in a community housing a toxic waste site. Now that was as of 1987. Next, please. And again, well, I've just made this point that clearly the EJ movement, with its origins in civil rights, has expanded significantly and is particularly important in the context of the social justice claims we see rising out of the really the deaths of George Floyd and others in police custody, and also the positioning of these issues in the context of elections. Next slide, please. All right. So I mentioned the executive order in 1994. There's NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and that's 1970. Some of you are aware, I believe, Richard Nixon was a Duke Law grad, and but President Nixon probably, but for Watergate, would have been known as the environmental president. We get NEPA, we get the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. This was a time when environmental issues were bipartisan issues. I know some of you are familiar with Interstate 40, which I believe begins in North Carolina and goes all the way to California. And when I started law school, they didn't even teach environmental law, Colton, so that tells you how long ago it was. But what's fascinating, there was a case called Overton Park. And those of you who might be from Western Tennessee, Memphis, are familiar with Overton Park. And the idea was to take this parkland to build the highway. And there was a group of citizens who formed themselves together and brought a lawsuit to stop it. The Supreme Court, and writing for the court, was Thurgood Marshall, who'd been to Memphis, Tennessee before. And he concluded that under this act, that this was a major federal action having a significant impact on the environment, and therefore it required an environmental impact study. And it's really what I call a stop-look statute, where it doesn't dictate a result, but it does dictate a process. And of course, when one takes a hard look, you realize that there are alternatives, including doing nothing, no action. And there may be other alternatives that have less of an impact. There are other laws that have been used to address environmental issues, increasingly Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And now, as you can see, almost all states have laws or policies that address EJ issues. And all the action is not in Washington. Some of it's in Sacramento or Raleigh or Trenton or Austin. And there's something else that you should be aware of as it relates to these environmental issues. For many statutes, they have what they call citizen suit provisions, which means that private citizens can bring cases, and they act as private attorneys general. So when the federal or state government does not act, and they're given 30 or 60 days to act, citizens can act. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk a little bit about EJ going forward. And what I would say, this is not your father's or your grandfather's Environmental Protection Agency. And I sense there are some smiles, and some of these people, both you may know, or whose names you've certainly recognized from the news. Michael Regan was the head of North Carolina's environmental agency. And if you followed his hearings, he intends to be very aggressive as it relates to EJ. Brenda Mallory is a woman with whom I've worked. She was in my firm for 15 years, and she's the head of Council on Environmental Quality. They report directly to President Biden, right there in the White House. And she is the one that's going to set the regulations for NEPA and determine how that works. Deb Haaland, who was just confirmed, is at the Department of the Interior. And so if you're talking about drilling on federal lands, if you're talking about permitting for that type of work, if you're talking about impact on migratory birds, all of these issues she has. But there are also EJ issues that Interior has that relate to native populations and native land. And those of you from Arizona and New Mexico, Colorado, will have some appreciation of that. Gina McCarthy was the former EPA administrator from Massachusetts, and she heads the Office of Domestic Climate Policy. Javier Becerra is now at HHS. He was the Attorney General for the state of California, succeeding Kamala Harris. And so there are, what makes this different is there's going to be kind of a one government approach toward EJ. I might have mentioned Granholm, Jennifer Granholm, who's going to be who is the secretary for the Department of Energy, head of the Department of Energy. So again, you can imagine that they're taking a different approach. Another thing that you'll find fascinating as it relates to EJ, they have suggested that about 40% of their resources, 40% of the cases that they intend to bring, they want to have EJ implications. So what does that mean? It means that if they're looking at Clean Water Act cases, that they're going to, or Safe Drinking Water Act cases, they're going to look at cases, ideally at least 40% of which impact poor and minority communities. So if you're from New Jersey, you know about the recent issues about lead in the drinking water in Trenton and in Newark, or in Flint, Michigan, or in Washington, D.C. And there are other communities around the country that have this issue. If you're from Pennsylvania, you know about the disproportionate impact on poor and minority children, asthma, and how, or California. So you have some understanding of these issues. So there's no question, but there will be a significant change. And let's see. Let's go to the next slide, please. So let's think about what this means. As I mentioned, EJ's at a turning point. There's a confluence of all of these issues that are happening now that impact this. We expect this administration to revise and reinvigorate the executive order. They're already doing that. They're building on agency accountability. You can see it at the Department of Energy. They're using their discretion. And you've heard about rollbacks of the rollback. So President Trump rolled back many of the initiatives of President Obama. And now President Biden is rolling back the rollbacks, if you will, of President Trump. And so there's drilling that's been stopped. There are projects that have been stopped. We anticipate increased monitoring, and under Title VI, a more aggressive use of that, providing a private right of action for citizens to protect themselves. And we think that Title VI can do for the environment what Title IX did for women's athletics. And this new approach is what they describe as a whole of government approach. And those of you who are pursuing an academic career, I want you to know there's power in that career. I have a friend who was a professor at Georgetown Law School. He's now at Harvard. He was a roommate of the Chief Justice Roberts. His name is Richard Lazarus, and he's written for years about how EJ concepts can be read into existing statutes. He says, you don't need new law, just read EJ into the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act or into Superfund. And guess what? People are finally reading Richard Lazarus, the professor, and incorporating his ideas and his thoughts. So please know you do not live in an ivory tower or you have the work that you do and the work that your professors do can change everything. Access to data is critical for fence line communities, right? Communities that live next to a refinery or next to a wastewater treatment plant or next to a facility that can impact their health. And next slide, please. So there's new legislation. I promised to talk about New Jersey a little bit there. And then the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection now has legislation that has empowered it to restrict or deny permits for certain facilities based upon EJ impacts. The other thing that has happened is that the state government is now speaking to environmental groups and environmental justice groups. They are inviting them to the party, if you will, inviting them to be at the table. In Connecticut, and there may be some students there from the Nutmeg State, it requires towns with over 5 affecting facilities to work with new developers to lessen impacts. And so I think this is truly important. And finally, well, as I mentioned, there are EJ advisory groups in Maryland, New York, North Carolina, Virginia, now Pennsylvania. So we're not going to see less of these things. We're going to see more of them. So someone was very kind enough to call me professor. I've had the privilege of teaching at the Howard Law School for the last 16 years. I'm an adjunct professor. And of course, the real professors will tell you the adjuncts aren't real professors, but I love our students. And suffice it to say, yes, the Toxic Waste and Race report of 1987 is one, but then there was one written 20 years later, Toxic Waste and Race at 20. And but I cannot begin to tell you there is no shortage of scholarly work that's been done on EJs, but those are two seminal pieces of work. Let's see if there's a couple others I might address. One of your classmates noted about another historic EIS movement related to the Durham Highway 147, which displaced Black middle-class communities and institutions. And so, yes, there's a very real tension between urban renewal and urban removal. And look, in the 1960s, any of you that live in a major urban area know that interstates came through communities and sometimes displaced historically Black communities. That was the case in Memphis and New Orleans and you name it. There's hardly a community that hasn't experienced that. And the promise was we will tear down this slum area, this undeveloped area, and we'll put something in new and better. But that never happened. And so you can go to some parts of some cities in America that look as though still there had been a war going on there. So there's a very real tension. One thing I would say about environmental justice, and I shouldn't joke, there are some issues that should be non-negotiable, right? I don't think one should ever negotiate away her or his health or the health of your community. On the other hand, it's important to be able to negotiate terms of a relationship that will benefit your community. So imagine, whenever that was, 1610, my recollection is for $23 in beads, there was a negotiation with the Manhattan Indians, right? And you had two cultures, a fundamentally different understanding of the land. One believed land belonged to God, the other believed that man could own land in fee simple. But if you really had a lawyer with foresight or community leader with foresight, you might have negotiated a different deal. We'll take the air rights above Madison Square Garden and any development across beyond the Brooklyn Bridge. And the problem was the terms of any agreement that Native people negotiated with prior countries that laid claim rights to North America. In our country, none of those agreements was honored, and they were broken in a different course for a different time. But I will say to you that there is an opportunity at times to negotiate better deals. There's something called a supplemental environmental project, and I've used those on behalf of some of my clients, where instead of sending money to Washington, they can spend that money addressing an EJ issue in the community in which they reside. And so I was involved in a significant case in New Orleans years ago, where we had two beaches in the days of segregation, Pontchartrain and Lincoln Beach. You can guess which one was a predominantly Black beach. Yes, Lincoln. And after integration, the Lincoln Beach was closed. But interestingly, there were about 10 acres of white goods ignominiously, embarrassingly dumped right there in a community in the Ninth Ward. Among the things we had done was to clean up that area, in addition to growing wetland grasses, protecting the trees, offering wildlife and nature tours at what was once the beach. And so there are things that can be done to improve a community, and being creative and thoughtful about those are extremely important. Let's go a little further. Oh, sorry. Let's see. Well, we may have gone one too far, but we may as well. This might be a hint that I should move on. Does anyone? So I have a theory whenever I speak with students, I want to challenge them. Do not be hierarchical. And my impression of the Duke students that I've met today and are within the sound of my voice is that you will not be hierarchical and you will not wait your turn. No, we should go on to the next slide, the picture of this little girl. And so my point is, you don't have to be a certain age to do something. There's no requirement. You do have to be 35 to run for president, but and you have to be a certain age in some states to drink. But other than that, or to drive, there are now no restrictions. Does anyone recognize this little girl? All right. Well, next slide. Well, that's Rachel Carson. Okay, and she was the first woman hired by the United States Bureau of Fisheries. She began her career as an environmental writer. She wrote brochures and other materials for the public. By 34, she had written her first book, Under the Sea Wind, and as we all know, Ms. Carson went on to publish Silent Spring, a book that many credit as starting the environmental movement. Can you imagine how they underestimated her? Could not have thought her capable of writing a book that changed the world. I would submit to you that not since Harriet Beecher Stowe as a woman author changed history more than Rachel Carson. And so, next slide, please. Anyone recognize this baby? Boy or girl, what do you say? Hard to tell gender by a face. Next slide, please. That's Thurgood Marshall. At age 27, he brought the case that Murray versus the state of Maryland, which integrated the University of Maryland School of Law. Rumor has it, frustrated he could not attend the University of Maryland. He attended Howard, and he said, I'll make them remember me. I think they do, and I think they did. 27 years old. Next slide. Anyone know who this is? There should be a hint. There's President Nixon to your left. This is Bill Ruckelshaus. Next slide. And he's 38 years old in that picture. He's the first administrator of EPA. Here he is receiving the Medal of Freedom from President Obama just a few years ago. And what is interesting about him, those of you who've read about Watergate know that there came a point where President Nixon wanted Professor Cox fired. He was a special prosecutor on Watergate. And he asked the then Attorney General Elliot Richardson, who'd been the governor of Massachusetts, to do that. Richardson refused and resigned. Ruckelshaus was the deputy. They asked him to do it, and he resigned. Out of work, he started our law firm. And I have a small personal story to tell you. In the last year or so, for 5 years, I was a court-appointed monitor on the Duke Energy coal ash spill. They had a terrible coal ash spill that entered the Dan River that separates Virginia from North Carolina. This was on Super Bowl Sunday, 2014. And so a lot of people were kind of asleep at the switch or watching the game, no doubt. And so in any event, I interviewed to do this work. Judge Howard, who has been a very, very positive influence in the management of that case, was determining who would represent, who would serve as the court-appointed monitor. And I'd read that early in his career, he had worked for the attorney who was representing President Nixon. And I said, oh my goodness, am I in trouble? Because Bill Ruckelshaus, who started my firm, and Ruckelshaus is not like Wilson or Ortiz or Rosen, pretty common. There are not many Ruckelshauses. And so suffice it to say, he did not, if he was aware of it, he sure didn't betray it, and he didn't hold that against me. All credit to Judge Howard. But Bill Ruckelshaus, an amazing man and an amazing life. Next, please. Anyone recognize this little girl? How about those glasses, huh? She was adopted as a young child, raised in New Orleans, later became the head of New Jersey DEP and the first Black woman to be the administrator of EPA. Next slide. Lisa Jackson, and an amazing, amazing woman now with Apple. And next, please. Or is that it? That may be it. Here we go. Another little girl. Anyone have any idea who she might be? All right. Next. This is Justice Sotomayor. You know, at 24 or 25, she was in the United States Supreme Court. Yes, she's prosecuting people who commit sexual crimes against children. You know, who'd have thunk that she'd be on the United States Supreme Court, but here she is. Let's see if she's last. Do I have one more? I probably do. Anybody know this little boy? Next slide. That's Martin Luther King. But at age 26, some of you are maybe not quite 26, but it's in the offing. 26. He led the Montgomery bus boycott and kind of revived the modern civil rights movement. Next. All right, that's it. Enough already. So if I could just tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, in the 1950s and early 1960s. And I'd like to tell you about a year in my life. I was 11 years old in 11 in 1963. And you probably seen film, newsreel of the students, high school kids, who had hoses and police dogs set up on them in Birmingham. And that was in the spring of 1963. That summer in my hometown of Jackson, Medgar Evers was murdered. He came home from a civil rights rally, and there was a man with a high-powered rifle hiding in the bushes near his home and killed him. That fall in September, there were 4 little girls, not quite little girls, ages 11 to 14. And between Sunday school and church, they were killed by men who left a bomb. And but that was all 1963 leading into 1964. And as a result of that, we got the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A year later, in 1965, John Lewis and others made good trouble crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I would submit to you that I left one other important point out. In the summer of 1964, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner were civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and they went through a pretense of looking for them. We all knew they were dead. We just didn't know where they were. And months later, their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam. And Goodman and Schwerner were from New York, and Chaney was from Mississippi. But as a result of what these people did, some from the Deep South, some from elsewhere, many students, you're right there in North Carolina. I think you know that the sit-ins began when 4 young men from North Carolina A&T State University sat in, insisting on service at a lunch counter. And that sparked 108 similar demonstrations across the country. The Freedom Riders, they were young students, white and black, from all across America, and they got on buses. And Atlanta, Birmingham, the bus was overturned in Anniston and burned. They got to my hometown in Jackson. But these were all young people who did not wait their turn. They were 19, 20, 21, 23, 25, and they insisted that they want change. You see, I believe this is a similar time. There's a time when we can have the change we want. But if these young people had not done what they've done, we would not have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There would be no Title VI to use to challenge environmental justice issues. There would be no Title IX. There would be no women's national basketball tournament tomorrow. And quite frankly, without the Voting Rights Act of 1965, does anyone remember Super Tuesday 2008? Hillary Clinton won New York State and most of those major states. Barack Obama won deep southern states, states that could never vote for him in the general election. But without that Civil Rights Act of 1964 and later the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you don't get Barack Obama. And if you don't get Barack Obama, you don't get Biden, and you don't get Harris, and you don't get Warnock, and you don't get Ossoff, and you don't get the change that many of you are demanding. So I tell you that personal story, and I try to tie it to today. You know, we have these injustice, racial injustice related to the murder of Black men and women held in custody by police. We have a pandemic that disproportionately impacts poor and working people and people of color. If we don't speak up now, if you don't speak and act now, we will never, ever forgive ourselves. You guys remember the famous statement, then they came for me, right? And so this is a unique time, a unique opportunity. These most recent incidents in and near Atlanta tell us that we must speak up. There was a woman, Kiyo Sato, who wrote from a Japanese internment camp. She was a first-year college student, and she ends her note. She says, "There is no place to go. No place to go. No one to help." And so I believe it's for us to help. I believe it's for these very brilliant students that I'm, some of whom I can see. I do see all of your names, and I know and expect that you will. And that's why I challenge you. Why not you? Why not now? And I thank you so much for your time. And if there are questions you wish to raise, please do. And yes, I would be willing to answer any questions you wish.
Before we get to the questions, I wanted to say thank you very much. I'm sure people are clapping with their microphones off behind their cameras, but it was incredible what you showed us and what you encouraged us to do. And thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing that. But since we have only 10 minutes, we probably move into the questions. You can see them, right?
I can.
Okay, I'll let you. I think there's one from Emily and one from Ashley.
Well, let me start with Emily's question, which was sharing some of the decisions I made in building my own path, choosing to pursue graduate school and early career moves. Well, for me, I chose law school. I was inspired very quickly by the example of several people whose names I'd like to share with you and ask that you look them up. One was Wiley Branton. Wiley represented the 9 school children who integrated the schools in Little Rock, and wonderful, wonderful man. And it changed the course of history. Another was A.P. Turow. If you're from Louisiana, you'll know about him. But you've seen that famous Norman Rockwell painting, Emily, of a little black girl in a pristine white dress, books and ruler in hand, an errant tomato against the wall, racial epithet scrawled, escorted to school by 4 headless U.S. Marshals. That was Mr. Turow's case. There was Alexander Luby in Nashville, Tennessee. He was from the British West Indies. His mother died at 5. His father later, he came to the U.S. as an orphan. He went to Columbia and NYU, and he represented those students from Fisk and Tennessee State and Vanderbilt and elsewhere who sat in and demonstrated. There was Donald Hollowell in Atlanta, Georgia. And when Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes integrated the University of Georgia, he was their lawyer. And in Alabama, there was Fred Gray at age 24, right? He's representing Martin Luther King. He's representing Rosa Parks, 24, 25 years old. Really? It's almost inconceivable. How is that? The problem was that older people were afraid. Whites were unwilling to, and he was 24 and crazy enough to do things that he might have thought better of perhaps at a later life. So they inspired me. There's a woman who inspired me. Her name was Constance Baker Motley. I'd never met a woman with 3 names. Emily, I thought she must be a physical giant. She was doing what men would not do. I was disappointed when I met her. She was stout, but she was not a physical giant. And I understood at age 11 that one did not have to be a physical giant to be a powerful force. And one did not have to be a man to change the world. And she did. The other thing that I would say respectfully is you have to adapt and you have to be resilient. Resiliency is the most important human quality. And you've not asked me, but I failed at various points in my career. But I never wanted my failures to be the ultimate evaluation of my career in my life. And if you do something long enough, you will fail. I also wanted to acknowledge a wonderful young woman, Hillary Jacobs, who works with me at my law firm. Most that's good here, she's had something to do with, and if it's fouled it up, it's probably my fault. Yeah, or actually it is my fault. But thank you, Hillary. What's the biggest challenge you face in your work and the most rewarding part? I think that almost every time I do something, whether it's said explicitly or implicitly, there's some question of my legitimacy. You know, are you the guy? Did you really go to school there? Do you really know this? And it bothers me a little bit, but then I kind of grind my teeth and I assume a position of aggression, and I'm ready to go. But I think the most rewarding part, though, is when I meet someone that, and I meet people every day, age 18 to 70, and they are ready to throw in the towel. They're ready to wave the white flag of surrender. Something has not gone right for them in their career or in their life. And if I can encourage them to hold out a little longer, try one more time, stick with it, persevere, and to see their success later, it's an amazing thing. And it's the most gratifying thing in the world to see someone else succeed. If I'm not answering your questions, please push me and make me do a better job. I wish to.
I think from Emily's response, you answered very well. I think we might have time for one more if anyone has a question. If not, Emily says, thank you. This is the most productive she's ever been during the pandemic on Zoom. So,
well, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Colton. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you to all the students that are here today. And remember, your words are powerful. Rachel Carson knew that. That's why she wrote. Your actions are important. Thurgood Marshall knew that. Martin Luther King knew that. Either could have settled comfortably into a middle-class life. They were born into that, and they chose to take a risk. Cheney was from Meridian. He knew what was going to happen to him. Goodman and Schwerner came from comfortable lives. I will tell you one story that I want you to remember. I was speaking in Seattle, Washington for a bar group, and someone said that the widow of Mickey Schwerner, and if you don't know who he is, please take a moment and look him up, was in the room. And I had this for 600 or 700 people there. And my voice is way too loud. I said, where is she? And she was sitting across the table from me. And it never occurred to me that this young man who was 24, when he gave his life, was married. But it occurred to me for the first time, well, he could have been. And this woman had dedicated her life to civil rights and other issues. And my tears welled up because I realized here they were at the beginning of their lives thinking they had a whole life together and a life they would never have. And yet he in his way and she in her way had both lived a life of purpose and, quite frankly, had made life better for me and for others. So I will tell you, if you're looking for satisfaction in your life, if you're at some point in the work that you do, make certain that there's something in it for someone other than yourself. And not all the time, not every time, but I think that will give you that peace of mind and that satisfaction. So I do feel compelled to answer Ashley's question. The biggest barriers to addressing EJ issues in the United States. Well, United States, we as a country have never really adequately dealt with race. And we still have difficulty with it every day. and Atlanta being the most recent, but hardly the only. And until we deal with race, we will never get there. I never agreed with the substance of his positions, but Ronald Reagan always said, you have a rendezvous with destiny. And something about that word rendezvous I liked. And I think each generation has a rendezvous with destiny, a challenge they may face. Your grandparents may have faced the Depression or great grandparents or the Second World War, or your parents may have dealt with Vietnam, but there's unfinished business, and EJ is a part of that. When I met with the dean of the Howard Law School, at that time he had been a law school classmate of mine, I said to him, environmental justice will be the major civil rights issue of the 21st century. You know, I think I'm right. And who gets the water? Who's entitled to clean air? You know, water is the one thing without which no one can live. You don't have to have food, but you have to have water, and it has to be clean. It has to be safe. So these are critical issues. And now we understand, and you guys certainly better than I, the interdependence we all have internationally, transboundary aspects. But we are actually in a battle to save our world, to save our planet. How do we deal with electric vehicles? Are we going to have sufficient power? How do we ensure we have solar power when the sun's not shining, and wind energy when the wind does not blow? What do we do with these batteries? Are we going to be able to bury them and reuse them so that they can be a source of storing energy when the sun's not out and the wind's not blowing? These are these climate justice issues. These are the great issues of the day. And I am grateful that there are students like you who are determined to answer them. And, so thank you so much. It's a privilege it's a privilege to be with you. And I only wish we had more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Once again, from everyone, we want to be respectful of your time, so we'll cut it there. But thank you for joining us, and thank you for the work you do.
Thank you for the privilege of being with you. And I look forward to seeing and reading about the great things that you will do in the future. There is no limit.
Most definitely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was an honor, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. Appreciate you both. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.